This is Mirage, number 3, speculating on speculative fiction and other topics. Today we're going to be discussing J.R.R Tolkien with the great Jason Abbott. Are you a J.R.R Tolkien scholar? Have you done incredible research on the guy, or are you like me and basically just going to be winging it today?
I've done quite a bit of study on Tolkien. I'm a fan, and
You're a fan, me too.
Yeah, and
I've done the main reading. I've done the Hobbit and the trilogy. I've never run the, how do you say it? The Cimarron, or how do you say it?
Oh man, that's some vocal gymnastics. The Cimarron, I believe.
I'm not going to bother.
Cimarron, I believe, is
posthumously published too. It's not really his work. I mean, it is his work. I just read this too. It was denied by the publisher after he published the Hobbit. That was supposed to be his sequel, his follow-up work.
Yeah, they said there's not enough hobbits in it. they sent it back to him. This great story was like, because like the Hobbit, and we talked about the Hobbit before, and Tolkien, with that being his first work that got published, and I have to correct myself on our first venture together when I was talking about Tolkien. I wasn't quite sure at the time whether the Hobbit was a big success or not. And financially wise, it didn't have a big return when it was originally released. However, the book was very well received. The publisher put it out there. It had really glowing reviews. It had great word of mouth, and it was widely read. And the publisher, they sold out of all 1,500 copies of the first edition that they put out. And
well, I mean, in terms of what he was, what amazes me about Tolkien, and I like how you say his name, so I'm gonna try to emulate that a little bit. Tolkien.
That is how it is believed that it was pronounced properly. There is debate about it, or whether that it matters or not. But in a lot of records, it's there's actually a notation when he signed up for, because during World War II they almost had him come in and write code languages he tried out for that, and there's a note next to the instructor who put down Keen next to his name, and they're like, for many years they thought that was like oh, he was pretty keen, he was a really smart guy, and what he actually was doing is trying to get his name right. So he put Keen next to like Tolkien. But there's still debate about it, but I try to go with the Tolkien, but I said for years Tolkien.
He's a very interesting guy. I mean, in terms of what he was a vet, obviously a war vet. He was in the Battle of the Somme. Over 600,000 people died in that battle. 600,000 people died.
Yep.
I mean, modern warfare, we're looking at like a few dozen people die in a battle on our side, the good guy side, and in terms of like the Allied side, 600,000 allies died in that battle, and it didn't last like years. I was thinking, oh, he was in for 5 years. Maybe it lasted several years. No, it lasted several months, and 600,000 people died around him. And a lot of those people just died and were left out into this field, and they got to see them rot from, I think, July to the end of the year or something along those lines.
Oh, yeah.
I still have it up on my computer. I'm going to verify the dates, but
they had
his mind. I mean, that he left that war with that.
Yeah, he went through a terrible. He was a man who experienced the worst shade of war, and he never there's no real record of him being a phenomenal. He was a patriot and he was a veteran, and he served, and I believe he was very proud of that service. But he was not a very good soldier. In fact, he spent a great deal of the First World War just being sick. Like and that wasn't entirely uncommon, because there were terrible amounts of disease that were affecting everybody.
As a former soldier, I got to tell you, there are no good soldiers, and everybody there are no better complainers than a soldier. That's all they do is complain. And then their bosses will send you out in front of bullets, and you hope to God you don't get shot. I remember when I was in, they would say the common misconception of people shooting in battle is that you never actually aim. You're pulling the trigger so you don't get yelled at. I mean, you're never actually aiming at anybody. You're just pulling the trigger so that you don't look like a coward.
Yep.
If you hit anybody, I mean, it's a total accident.
I've seen a statistic that says that of all bullets ever fired in war, less than 1% actually hit anything.
And it's probably an accident.
Yeah,
It's
probably.
probably,
I mean,
yeah.
that's why when they introduced the machine gun, which was very prevalent in World War One, that there were just so many that they could throw up. It was so different than how they had been trained to fight war prior to that time. It was the first time that mechanized powers kind of came up in that way, and they say that that's why when the Americans finally got into World War One, that they did slightly better because they had been through the experience of the Civil War decades before, which kind of had them have a different kind of mindset than the standing regular armies of Europe. But the Germans were also really, really crafty.
Yeah.
They fought very, very smart. Like they would dig these incredible entrenchments so that all the shelling wouldn't get them, and then they would fortify and fortify. And you had a lot of officers on the Allied side that were there because of family connections and not really because of merit.
Yeah.
Because they were upper class, and all the grunts and foot soldiers were lower class people.
Well, that's the way it works,
Yeah,
unfortunately. They're not trained. I mean, they're just there to catch bullets.
yeah.
Catch bullets and throw bullets. I mean, that's basically all the lower classes are for. Dig holes.
Yep. And Tolkien, his experience really, I think you can really see how that influenced his work. I mean, he was coming up with stories and works before he entered into military service, but afterwards, like he's quoted as saying that, you know, before the war, I had dozens of friends, and after the war, I save one, they were all killed in the war.
Yeah.
And
Terrible.
that story was repeated over and over again, and it didn't help that the way, I know this is true for the British and probably for other countries, that the way they recruited regiments and battalions, they would get all the same folks from the same area to work together. So if you were from a town, you'd be serving with all your other friends that you knew from the same town. And then when you had these whole regiments get wiped out like in a day, whole towns would lose a whole generation of men. And you'd be fighting with your friends and buddies, and like literally people you've known since you were a kid, and they would all
Oh
be
man,
dead.
that's gonna mess you up too. They
Oh
don't do
yeah.
that anymore. I mean, you
Oh
don't.
no,
Maybe
no,
you
they
go to
changed that.
basic training with battle buddy or something. I think that when I went in, they called it your battle buddy, but you
Mhm.
didn't get stationed with the guy. I mean, maybe I don't know. I didn't have a battle buddy when I went to basic training, so I don't know what happened when you went to permanent party with you. They split you up or whatever.
But you didn't go to
But
grade school with your battle buddy, most
no,
likely.
no,
They
you
actually.
did.
Oh
No, you
really?
did.
You
Like
went.
they had it set up. If you had a best friend and you joined together, you
Uh-huh.
would go to basic training with them. But I didn't do that, so I don't know what would happen after basic training or AIT if you went to the same duty station or whatever.
I know that in
Um,
America that they stopped doing like everybody from the same place. That Britain
mhm.
stopped doing it because of what they're
Yeah, they
experiencing in
don't
World
do that
War One.
anymore in this country. But it's
And
all
in
volunteer military anyway.
Yeah, and in
If
World
we
War
went to war
Two,
with Korea or China, maybe things would change
yeah,
because you're
in
talking like a mass enlistment. I mean, it's hard to pull things apart like that.
yeah. Well, in the United States tried after the Solomon brothers,
Are
after
you
their
talking about the Band, not Band of Brothers? What was that movie that Spielberg directed?
you're thinking of Saving Private Ryan.
Yeah.
But that's actually referenced in the movie. The Sullivan brothers, they were actually in the Navy, and they all signed up after Pearl Harbor, but they said we all have to we all sign up together or we don't sign up at all. And this was before the draft. So they made a deal with these five brothers, and they put them all in the same ship. And while the Japanese had attacked the ship, and all five brothers died. So after that, the Navy and all the other American forces said, if you're related, you can't be in the same unit because they don't want the tragedy of somebody losing their entire family.
I just don't think the military cares. I mean, as a publicity stunt, they'll say they do, but I know they don't care.
Well, they made that a
You know what I
model.
mean?
Yeah, I hear you. I hear you. I mean, we're a
After the
different.
fact, they may say, "Oh, we're not going to kill a whole family. We're not going to do it." But if they needed to, they would.
You know, uh,
This battle lasted from July until November.
if
That's it. That's only 5 months. They killed 600,000 people on one
yep,
side.
yep,
That's
yep.
one side of this battle. The other side, the German forces. How many people died?
Um,
They killed they killed 1 million 1,000,000.1 people died in this 5 months of this battle during World
Mm-hmm.
War One.
Mm-hmm.
This guy who wrote these 4 books plus the the one that we don't count because his son published it posthumously. You can count it if you want.
I counted. I mean, like Tolkien had been working on that mythology for years, and it forms the basis of everything that he did with his books, particularly those after with the trilogy and with the Hobbit to an extent. But
man,
I think
that's
that
where we part ways, because the Hobbit was like it was a good book, and I really enjoyed the Hobbit, but the voice in the Hobbit and the voice in the trilogy are so different. They're just so different.
Well, definitely. And he went back and he did a revised revision of The Hobbit in his later years, because in the very original version of The Hobbit, Gollum and the Ring, he in the original version, Gollum is very, very flippant about putting it up as a bet for winning these riddles, and he had to alter that chapter, Riddles in the Dark, quite a bit to make it fit with the later books, and that's something that he did. He wrote.
I forget, honestly, if there was a connection there.
Yeah,
I mean, there is, honestly. I mean, I guess
that's a major connection.
There's like a huge, gigantic connection between those books, and how could you forget? Because really, if Gollum hadn't given that ring away, which he never really intended to do anyway, and really he lost it on the beach. If he hadn't lost that stupid ring, it wasn't on the beach. It was, where was it?
In a cave underneath of the where the goblins were. Bilbo,
and it wasn't that he lost it; the ring lost him. The ring fell off, and
he didn't realize that it was missing. And in the revised version, Bilbo picks it up, and it ends up becoming part of the riddle. It's like, guess what's in my pocket? And
okay, hold on a second. Spoiler alert.
but definitely the One Ring is the whole MacGuffin that makes the Lord of the Rings trilogy
absolutely the whole thing, right?
And so Tolkien had to
even Smog the Dragon, the whole end of the story. I mean, the whole chink in the armor thing wouldn't happen without the ring.
And the end of that story, I think, to touch lightly on the war experience, the end of the Hobbit, where you have the battle, where you have the army of dwarves and the army of men, and then and the army of elves, and they're all going to fight over the dragon's gold, and then like an even bigger army of goblins shows up, and they all like, well, you know what, under the current circumstances, I think that we should all become allies. And Bilbo is just that, the way that that was something that was very disheartening to me about the Hobbit movies that came out a few years ago. And that not only did they stretch the story, and Bilbo has a line, and I'm not quite sure if it's in the book or just in the book and the movie, or just the movie, but he says, "I feel very thin, like bread on butter that's been stretched too thin." That's been spread too far, and that's how the Hobbit was. They really, I mean, some of the scenes were wonderful to see, but when it came to the battle, they changed the battle of the 5 armies, and it became this huge epic thing. And in the book, Bilbo gets knocked out, and he just skips to the end of it, and it's a huge thing where he's like, "This." Yeah,
he wakes up, doesn't he? And there's a huge battle going on.
Yeah, and he wakes up after the battle, and Thorin is dying, and
there's 2 things I want to do, honestly. The best adaptation is the cartoon, the animated version. I can't remember the name of the guy who did it, and I can look it up if you don't remember, but I have a feeling you do remember.
Oh, you're talking about the Baskin-Rosh version that was done in the very early 80s?
I'm going to trust that you do know, because that one honestly did such a great version of The Hobbit.
And all the great songs.
I'd be surprised.
The greatest adventure is the one lies ahead. I love that. That's classic. I have it on. I have it on DVD. That's one of my favorites.
That's the best. And then the other thing I wanted to cover also is the ring being discovered.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, missing from Gollum. Let's discuss that for a minute. I mean, obviously we're discussing the book and not the author, but I think it's important because of the fact that without that ring, you don't have the trilogy. How does Gollum lose the ring? How does Gollum lose that ring? It's not just misplaced. You know what I mean?
Yes,
it has off his finger, doesn't it? I mean, it has to fall off his finger. He has to be wearing it.
Well, he doesn't wear it all the time.
Why wouldn't he wear it all the time? Why wouldn't he be wearing it when he lost it?
Well, it's just he likes to hold it and to admire it. I believe he takes it off, and Golem is crazy. Anyways, he's got a split personality. He both loves the ring and he hates it. So, but the thing is that you have to remember about the ring is that the ring has a will of its own. It is
That's what I'm saying. That's what I wanted to discuss.
It is inexorably linked to Sauron, and the ring had been using Golem to hide from the world while in Mordor, Sauron's armies were slowly being built, and Sauron himself was existing in an incorporeal kind of form.
So what does the ring want, though? Does the ring want to get destroyed? Because ultimately, that's what the ring got.
Oh,
the ring got destroyed.
The ring wants to return to Sauron. As is said many a time that his every intent and will is bent upon it.
But if the ring wants to get to Sauron, why didn't it push Gollum to leave the cave and go to Sauron? It has this weak-willed individual, you know what I mean, who it forced Gollum to look for the ring so it can bring it to Sauron or whatever it was doing to Gollum during the trilogy. Why did it not do that in The Hobbit?
Do you want
assume?
Do you want my honest answer on that?
Yeah. No, I want you to lie to me. Please lie.
here's my honest answer. Because let's
assume that J.R.R Tolkien was wise from the get-go and knew exactly where he was going to end up with his 4 books, and that all 4 book parts were, part of the story from the get-go.
Okay, now I'm getting a little confused. So are you talking about how he modified after the fact, how Gollum lost the ring?
No, I don't know. I'm actually talking about how the ring has a will. The ring fell off Gollum somehow. Let's assume it has a will of its own, and it found its way into Bilbo's pocket. What's the ring looking for?
Well, the ring was looking to escape and to find someone to take it back to Mordor and Sauron.
Why didn't it influence Gollum to do that then?
Well, here, you want my honest answer?
Yes.
Because if Gollum just walked to Mordor and handed it over to the orcs, it would suck as a story.
Okay, I don't want your honest answer is horrible. Give me another answer. Give me a better answer.
You can look at any story and you can find some sort of inconsistency, and it's like, why? Well, if it just did this, you can shoot down almost any story with like a what if this. But like as far as like what's going on from it. And I'm not being just flippant with that. I mean, obviously, you got to have a story, and mistakes sometimes have to be made. There's lots of things that happen in the Lord of the Rings that make you scratch your head. Like, what point does Tom Bombadil play in the Fellowship of the Ring? I mean, it's like an editor could say you could kind of cut this part, and that's exactly what they did in the movie.
Yeah.
But it does lose some of its Sylvain kind of character, and I love some of Tom Bombadil's
I remember reading that he had a hard time with that part too, because for the longest time, that's where his story stopped.
Yeah,
he had the worst writer's block when he got there. He could not continue the story, and at some point he just push past it. I mean, great. Yeah, there's no point to that. He got there and it's like, boom, okay, my characters are at this blah, whatever it was, a tree, I think.
Yeah, and I think that a lot of writers might have looked back at that and made like a hard choice and said, you know what, I really didn't know where I was going on this bit, and I think I could cut this. Yeah. And he's like, but I really came up with all this great stuff, so I'm going to keep it in there. I've done that with some of my stories, not to such a length,
right? I mean, didn't he had to put him back in eventually at one point, right? He came back. He did something.
Bombadil?
Yeah.
No,
I'm wrong. It's been almost a day. It's been almost 15 years since I read the story.
I'm trying to recollect. It's been about that long for me too. I don't know if he shows up in the Scouring of the Shire at the end or not. I honestly can't remember, and I'd have to think about that and flip open my copies. I do remember loving all of Bombadil's poetry and everything that he did. That was very fun. But like to get back on target about the ring and the will of the ring wanting to get back to Mordor. I think it could have fallen off with the intent that the mountain, it's said that it came into the hands of the most unlikely creature, because a hobbit was not the kind of critter that should have been walking around in this mountain that was teeming and filled with goblins. In fact, the ring may have been attempting to get into the hands of a goblin, aka an orc. It's just different in Tolkien's universe; they're interchangeable words. The mountain was crawling with goblins, and they would show up down at this underground lake where Gollum was, but he had this tendency to kill them and eat them, so they didn't have a chance to get a hold of the ring. So the ring may have like fallen off and rolled around and gotten lost many times. We don't know before we meet Gollum in the Hobbit, but eventually, I think its desire may have been to end up in the hands of one of those orcs, and then they would have started fighting because they're easily corrupted, or they would have just known by its nature what it was all about, and then it would have made its way to Mordor. Failing that, if it could have gotten into the hands of a man, it could have created all kinds of havoc in the lands of men on the way to Mordor, or just to open up the door for invasion from Mordor. But instead, you had Bill. Yeah.
It's very interesting that it corrupted Gollum to the point that he hid himself in a cave.
Yes.
What was Gollum? Was he a hobbit or some creature like a hobbit? I guess he was a hobbit, right?
He was a being like hobbits, like a river hobbit. They were a race that had long vanished since, because Gollum had unnaturally long life. He was over 600 years old or close to it by the time that Bilbo meets him in The Hobbit. So the ring had extended his life, just as for Bilbo, Bilbo has an extended amount of life, but not nearly to the same amount in the beginning of the Fellowship of the Ring. But a Hobbit, and this is one thing I love about Tolkien's Middle Earth and the Hobbits in particular, because Sauron had made rings of power for all of the important races of Middle Earth, for the dwarves,
for the hobbits,
for the elves, for men, but he did not think that the hobbits were important enough to bother with. They weren't even on his radar. And the one thing that's going to get you is the thing that you underestimate. And the motif of the hobbits, they're small. I mean, in the books, in the movies, they're pretty small, but in the books, they're literally half the size of a man. They're like 3 feet tall.
Yeah.
So they're very, 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 and they're not great warriors. They're not wizards. They're not warriors. They don't really have anything that everybody feels compelled to try to protect them. And that image, they're overlooked, and it ends up, the ring is picked up by a hobbit, and the ring's kind of like WTF. See, and I think that Bilbo is just they've kind of got this natural, their race as a whole, as a race, they haven't encountered this taint of the rings of power. So therefore the ring doesn't have an easy in on Bilbo as a hobbit. It's only over a long period of time, and Bilbo, the hobbits are kind of shown to have a bit of a resistance. If you look at the track record of Bilbo, and then Frodo, and even Sam, over time the ring will get to them, as it definitely got to Frodo. Bilbo mostly kept it as a souvenir, so he wasn't bearing it and holding it. And one could say that Frodo fell prey to the ring more because he knew exactly what it was, and Sauron was so bent and intent on finding it that it was kind of like more radioactive, if you want to look at it that way, that it got into his head a lot more. But Sam,
I wonder if you could say that the ring got to Bilbo in his attempt to document his adventure. Kind of an egotistical bent to put words to paper like that. It's very anti-Hobbit.
I suppose, yeah. Well, Bilbo wasn't even before he encountered the ring, he made some choices that were not very hobbitish.
Well, the adventure, that was kind of the wizard's fault, though, and the dwarves.
I was barely involved, Brian, barely involved. But yeah, one could make a point for that. It's interesting in the revised version. There's an annotation put in there in the revised version of The Hobbit, which includes the different maybe not outcome, definitely not a different outcome, but a different setup to Gollum losing the ring. And Bilbo actually puts a note here, and he says, "I'm very sorry that at the time I wrote the first accounting of this, I lied because I was under the influence of the ring, to not tell it exactly as it was said, so that the true nature of the ring wasn't revealed." So Tolkien put in that into the revised edition, which is rather clever, if you ask me. But to finish up on my point, I think that the hobbits had kind of a resistance to corruption. I don't think that they were immune. I think it would get them it just took a little bit longer of exposure for them to get to it. But because of that resistance, they were the perfect people to bear the ring and to ultimately to hold it until to get to the point to destroy it. But we know that ultimately the ring destroyed itself, and that's the great twist. Sorry about the spoiler. That it's
well, the question is, what is Sauron? And he's not alive, right? In terms of man, living, breathing, heart, lungs. He's not a thing. He's more like a demon. He's like a Satan, a devil, a spirit.
He's very much like a satanic kind of character in that he's a fallen and this is where there's such a rich mythology that Tolkien has, that he doesn't have a polytheistic gods. He has Iluvatar, who is like the great god, and the lesser beings, which are powerful and kind of like gods and do a lot of godlike things, are actually more akin to like the Christian idea of choirs of angels. It gets overlooked that Gandalf isn't just some guy. He's he's actually a celestial being that's been sent to Earth, and he's in the form of a man. And Sauron is similar to that. Sauron was a lieutenant under Morgoth.
So that's very interesting, though, in terms of what the ring is attempting to do, because the ring isn't really trying to get a person to bring it back to Sauron. What the ring is trying to do is make that being corrupt and become the worker of Sauron.
Well, it's believed that it was believed, I think it was even stated, or it's just believed, that if Sauron had gotten the ring back, that he would be able to reassume a corporeal form. And that without it, he was kind of like a ghost, an incorporeal thing. But he was not. It all goes back to this great schism and war, because there was one of these like very powerful beings that Iluvatar created to help navigate the universe, was a being that ended up being called Morgoth. And Morgoth, in a very very similar to Satan kind of way, turned against Iluvatar, the creator, and wrote and built an army because he felt that he should be as great as Iluvatar, as God.
So is Tolkien a good writer, or is Tolkien a phenomenal world builder?
Oh, I'd say that he's both.
Because I mean, he did build. You're a world builder, right? We talked about this when you were on my podcast. So I mean, it's really wonderful that we're talking about Tolkien. I mean, he did what you were doing, right? He built this magnificent world. I mean, we're talking about what he did: gods and angels and continents and kings and laws and blood and people and races. But where's the story? He wrote this trilogy, great, but there's so much more story here that he intended to write. I mean, he has one ring, right? We destroyed it.
Yeah, the one ring.
All of his plans for this one god it ruined it. And he just ruined all of his plans because of this one ring. So, why did you build this whole world, though? Because now it's all destroyed because of this one ring, right? Everything is done. Now everything is like, all the plans of the bad guy have been destroyed. And I guess that's interesting because the one ring destroyed it all, right?
Well, Sauron, he used the one, he created the one ring as a one control ring for all of the rings of power.
I mean, in the other rings are still out there, right?
Yes.
So without that one ring, they're useless. Sauron cannot become corporeal. He cannot retain his physical body. He cannot rule the realms of man. He cannot become a thing any longer.
Well, when the ring is destroyed, Sauron's fate is bound to the ring. He bound his fate to the ring itself, and
To
so when
all of the rings, though, not just the one ring. He
to the
needs all of the rings to become.
well, and we're
Oops.
getting into a depth of lore here. I'm not sure of the fate of all of the rings of power
But they need them all,
after
though. He
the
can't
War
just
of the
have
Ring.
the six. He needs that seventh one. He needs them all to exist. So, I mean, even he could have destroyed any of the other ones too. And what are they called? The Wraths, right?
You're talking about the nine ring wraiths.
Oh, am I?
Those were
Wait,
the nine rings that the are all the ring wraths were former kings that were bearers of the nine rings of power that he gave to the race of men.
so which is the? I thought there were seven rings. Am I wrong?
There. I believe that nine rings were given to the kings of men, and
Okay.
and they were corrupted the worst of all. And they ended up when
Okay.
they ended up becoming the ring wraiths under directly like they were his boot licking lapdogs. After they were so thoroughly corrupted. There were seven rings of power that were given to the dwarf lords. And not
Okay.
and Tolkien doesn't talk too much about those in the story. And then there are three rings of power which were given to the elves.
It's so interesting though, in terms of the numbers and the whatever. I mean, he obviously did write a lot of this stuff down and the stories. That's just very interesting in terms of world building. And I was just looking at an article about his world building, and it's amazing. I mean, the amount of time that he wrote built into stuff is immense,
It was a lifetime.
right? And
You
he
know,
didn't have enough time to do it. And I guess when his son did jump in and start adding to it and taking his notes and publishing stuff posthumously.
well, the Silmarillion, which is kind of the mythos behind the Lord of the Rings, particularly, and I think that was still coming together in his mind when he was writing The Hobbit. Um,
Well, what I was reading before getting on the call with you is he published The Hobbit,
mhm.
and we discussed how The Hobbit was not very financially successful for his
Yeah,
publisher. It
let
wasn't.
me step in and clarify on that.
Sure.
It was the Hobbit. They sold out of all 1,500 copies that they printed for the book.
1500.
And the book had glowing reviews and people loved it, and they're like, great, let's publish a new print run, let's get some more books out there because these are selling like hotcakes. But there was a paper shortage because World War II had started,
Really,
and
it was prior to World War II. I didn't know that.
it came out just before World War II.
Oh wow.
So by the time that it got out there and it got momentum, it was published in September of 1937, and for Europe, everything began in September of 1939. So it had only been out for a couple years, and and back then, it took a little while for a book to build up momentum, but it was doing really well, and it was really well reviewed, and a bunch of people wanted to read it. But by the time they were like, great, let's print some more books of The Hobbit. And it's like, nope, no paper. It's all for the war effort. And it wasn't until well after World War II that they were able to publish new editions of it to get that back on the book. So but the book, so like the book, it's kind of like that must have been a real bummer. I mean, I'm sure that Tolkien had other things as a citizen, where Hitler is bombing his country every night. I'm sure he had bigger things on his mind.
Well, I mean, let's go back to the very beginning of
Yeah.
our talk. I mean, we're talking about 1 million people dying around him in a space of
Hmm.
5 months during his
Yeah.
5-year military career, and all of a sudden he's a middle-aged man watching the world explode around him. I'm
Hmm.
not going to be writing anything. I don't know about you. He's got nothing to publish. One
Yeah.
of my favorite things that you've said to me during the course of our friendship is, if you want to sell your first book, write your second. If you want to sell your second, write your third. Poor Mr. Tolkien is stuck in the middle of a war as a middle-aged citizen waiting to die. He wrote his first book. It's a classic. It's going to go down as one of the best fantasy novels of all time. At the end of World War II, he's written this thing that's basically worthless as a bunch of notes. His publisher rejects it. He's got nothing. You know what I mean? He's written a great book. He's got nothing. In 1953, I think, he finally produces what we know as the Fellowship of the Ring.
Yep.
And he was stuck, 75 pages into it for the longest time. Finally, he pushed past the writer's block. I mean, what do you call that? I call that a tremendous defeat in terms of being stuck. I mean, we're talking about a decade and a half. No, I'm talking about 2 decades worth of writer's block there.
Well, I don't think that he had a writer's block as such. I think he was probably he's someone who really wanted to fine tune his stories and he wanted to work them out. But
obviously,
I mean,
we weren't there, but he did not produce anything.
Well,
except the novel that was rejected by his publisher because it was nothing but notes. I mean, you've read it. I've tried to read it. It's very difficult to read.
Yeah, he presented it to, and it was just too thick. It wasn't, and it didn't have a consistent enough story in it. Yeah. They were like, this is a bunch of interrelated stories. It's like a collection of different mythology.
Yeah, it's a collection.
It's not, and they were looking, and they're like, Professor, what we wanted was like something with hobbits in it, and exactly. like the Hobbit. They were looking for like another like juvenile fantasy book like the Hobbit. And
has there ever been? Have you ever read a biography about him that talks about his time during World War II and where his mental state was? Has there ever been like a study of his journal entries during that time period, or what his thoughts were?
He was very concerned about some of his children that were in service and during World War. Some of his sons, I believe, I think even Christopher Tolkien, who has been the great guardian and promoter of his estate, was involved with that, and he wrote him some letters about that and whatnot. But I'd have to do some research on that. I'm not entirely.
So his son was fighting in that horrible.
I remember that his family. Let me check up on Christopher Tolkien here. Christopher Tolkien was born in 1924. So in 1940, he would have been like 18. So
18. Maybe it wouldn't matter because I would imagine Tolkien would have gotten him into Oxford. Maybe he was a student at the time.
Yeah, Christopher Tolkien entered the Royal Air Force in the summer of 1943, and he was sent to South Africa. So he remained with the RAF until the mid 1945. So, and then and he ended up going to Trinity and then Oxford, where his dear old dad was professor. And also Tolkien had many things going on at the time. I mean, he had the Inklings, which was a group of like-minded authors who would get together, and they would, including C.S. Lewis and a number of other notables, and they would get together once a week.
One of my favorite authors growing up. I loved him.
And Tolkien had many intellectual friendships, and he was a professor, so he had things going on with that, doing his professor type stuff. He was a busy guy. I don't think there's nothing that I've read about Tolkien during World War II that he was in a depressive stage. I mean, and if you look at the Hobbit, it was really well received. The publisher wanted to publish more books. There just was no paper to do it. I don't think that Tolkien would look at, and especially as his income and his happiness. I mean, he was a very loving father of 4 kids. They were, he was totally in love with his wife Edith, and
he died 2 years later than her. I mean,
not even 21 months.
Wow.
She was his muse, and they have a beautiful love story with each other. But I really don't think that he was depressed during the time. I think he probably just said, "Well, damn you, Hitler! I would have been able to get my book out sooner." And truth to be told, as soon as the war, it took a little while after the war was over, but then eventually they printed it, and it's never gone out of print.
Brandon Sanderson is a guy who I've not read anything of, and I just keep hearing about his name popping up in conversations in my other podcast, Origin. Everybody's saying he's like the best fantasy writer of the 21st century. I can't attest to that, but how many novels has that dude written? Like 50,000 at this point?
Oh, he's very lines. And if you compare Tolkien to either a contemporary like C.S. Lewis far outwrote
I
Tolkien.
only know 7 of C.S. Lewis's novels, and I didn't even realize he wrote more than that. I just read his 7 over and over and over, The Chronicles of Narnia.
Well, Narnia I will probably say his most well known, but as a
Yeah.
Christian apologist, he wrote very vastly on faith, and he was actually on World War II. C.S. Lewis was on the radio, and he gave very famous radio broadcasts speaking about Christianity and the need to stand up and to do what's right in the face of Hitler, and he was an atheist. He C.S. Lewis was an
It's pretty
atheist.
interesting. I did not know that. Honestly, I heard about the Christianity context and him, and I just assumed he was a Christian.
No, his mother died when he was very, very young. I think like younger than 5. And his father was very cold and distant, and so he had no real relationship with them. And when he was pretty young, like in his, I think around 14, he said, "You know what? God's a lie," and he became an atheist, and he remained that way, going through the whole. And like he was in World War I as well, and saw like his buddies get knocked off, and he's like, there is no God. And then he met Tolkien, and Tolkien was a devout Catholic. And Tolkien, that he and a few of other friends, because they were in the Inklings, had a number of very philosophical but friendly. He and Tolkien were great friends. They would hang out all the time. In fact, Tolkien's wife Edith got a little bit jealous of Lewis at times, because they hung out a little bit too much, in her opinion, and he had a little bit too much influence in the family. But Tolkien convinced Lewis that you really should give Christianity a chance, and he made a very good argument to the very rational C.S. Lewis, and he thought about it, and then he said, I basically was dragged to my knees, kicking and screaming, but I did in the end accept God. And then from there things built up for him. But Tolkien was a little bit put out because C.S. Lewis decided to join the Anglican Church rather than become a Catholic. So and that just, it's like, oh, come on. Well, I'm glad you went to Christianity, but and Tolkien also didn't kind of like how he did it as like straight as a lot. The way that he did the Narnia books was not really to Tolkien's taste, but they were great friends for a very long time. So
I love the Narnia books. They were my favorite growing up.
But Lewis he has tons of books beyond Narnia, a lot of nonfiction
too. I'm
Yeah.
not going to read the nonfiction, but I'd like to do a little exploration on C.S. Lewis. Also, Terry Pratchett too. I've been challenged to read a little bit of him by Chris Herron.
Funny guy. You need to start with his early books though, or you'll get kind of a little bit lost if you don't pick the early
Magic
stuff.
I think is what I'm reading. What is that? Color of Magic. Discworld series is what I think I'm starting with. Book 1.
Yeah, that's where you got to start, like the early books, because if you try to get into the later stuff, it's very confusing, because the books, they technically you could read them without reading the earlier stuff, but it's really helpful to start with the new stuff, and then as you move up in the books in a kind of a sequence and order, it becomes it's a lot easier to get into him.
I hope I can get into him. I may hear so many good things about him. This is a Tolkien podcast, not a Pratchett podcast, but in terms of Pratchett, is he a YA author or is he just general fiction?
I don't think most people would consider his stuff young adult, but there's so much humor in it, and he doesn't really go into very dark or sexual subjects very often. So I would say that there probably can be read by younger readers, but I don't think they were initially penned to be put towards there. They've got a great deal of that really witty humor that he's got in there, and he doesn't really go into subjects that would be too offensive for a younger reader. So I don't. And though the crafting of his language might, they might find it a bit stale. I'd have to really sit down and like read through one of his books again to really think about it, because I did not read them as a kid.
Just to segue back to Tolkien, that's what's interesting about him for me also, is the Hobbit versus the trilogy. The Hobbit was definitely geared as a YA fantasy novel. It was geared for children, like a what do they call it, a bedtime story.
Oh yes.
And you have this really heavy, really dense fantasy story, and it's good, and it's readable, and it's really thick and meaty. I mean, you're pulling off chunks of greatness with it, and they don't go together at all.
Well, they
go together too. I mean, they're like, I guess they're peanut butter and jelly. I mean, they just like this really, really nice prologue and this really, really dense ragu or something. I don't know. It's like go together so nicely, but not at all. You know what I mean?
I do know what you mean, and I have an explanation for that. I have this, and it ties into everything that we've been talking about. Tolkien, I think that he decided to publish, I think he even just came up with these stories. As it was mentioned several times in this conversation, he was a father of four, a very devoted father of four. And I think
I know what your explanation.
I think
the children got like he was writing for them.
Exactly. I think that Tolkien was probably the best bedtime story reader in the world. He doted on his, well, I don't know, doting might be a downplay of it, but he was a devoted father, and he would do things. I don't know if you've ever heard of the Father Christmas letters, but Tolkien for 22 years, okay, let me restate that, for 22 years, he would create meticulous letters from Father Christmas, aka Santa Claus, British Santa Claus. And he would have these letters delivered, and this would be a whole story about all of Father Christmas's adventures throughout the years. And he began coming up with the Elvish language in the letters from Father Christmas. He illustrated them himself. He made sure that they were postmarked from the North Pole, and he even created elaborate stamps and postmarks that he would indel on the letters himself, so that he would maintain this completely consistent world that his children were getting a letter from Father Christmas. And then he would gather the whole family around, and he would read from the letters, and he would pass the letters around, including illustrations of polar bears and goblins that would come up and cause problems for Father Christmas, and Father Christmas's elven assistants and his secretary and and he would spend like all this, like a humongous amount of effort to create this. And he did this for 22 years for the whole family. He only stopped, I think, in 1940 because the kids had kind of grown out of it at that point.
I wonder how old the youngest kid was at that point.
And so by that point, Christopher Tolkien was probably in his late teens.
Well, is he the youngest?
No, he was the middle oldest child, I believe. Yeah, he was the second. He was the middle child. He was the next to the youngest. His youngest was his daughter, Priscilla.
Yeah, 1929. When did you say they quit? 44. It's just 15 years old.
Right around 1940. I think the last one was from 1939. 1949. But those letters then stopped, but they kept them, and they have actually released them, and they are fantastic. Cool. They released them posthumously, not long after his death, and I believe that Tolkien got his start. He was telling stories. Edith, his wife, was his muse, and I think that he was telling stories even before but she inspired him to a new level of storytelling. And then the children that he loved with her inspired him. He was just this dad, and everybody who talks about Tolkien says they couldn't go on walks with the guy because he would start telling stories, and like a walk from less than a mile would take like 3 or 5 hours because he would stop at every tree and start coming up with mythologies on the spot. So I believe that he took all of that storytelling that he got his start with in the Father Christmas letters and reading those aloud and putting in all his wonderful roles of language. I don't know if you've had the opportunity, but on my blog, I found on SoundCloud that there are a few clips of him reading his own work from the Lord of the Rings. Yes.
Why don't you do me a favor then and shoot me that stuff so I can put them in the notes
after our talk? Absolutely.
If you know anything else, if you have stuff like that, shoot me emails filled with it so I can put that in the notes.
Yeah, there is an amazing. It's there. The two that I have found so far. There's one of him reading from stuff all over from Lord of the Rings. It's all kind of like a greatest hits. It's about 18 minutes long. And then the second one is entirely him reading part of the passage of Riddles in the Dark from The Hobbit, and it's amazing to listen to. It is such a fantastic thing because he puts in all the role and the importance of language and everything into both of those pieces. And particularly in The Hobbit, you can hear that storytelling. You can hear him, because The Hobbit is a great story to read to kids. I've had the pleasure of reading it to kids once, and I'd do it again. And the way that he puts on the voices of Gollum and of Bilbo, and you can hear the way that he speaks Gollum's voice. And I know that Andy Serkis must have heard this recording because there is a total inflection and inspiration there. So yes,
So cool.
I think that Tolkien was inspired to write, because he could have just been a professor of languages, perfectly happy with that, and all of the other things he did with the Inklings. I think that he was inspired, that he had this idea. The famous story is that somebody handed in a test with a blank page on it, and the student hadn't filled it in. He's like, well, so he scribbled down on it. He says, away in a hole there once lived a hobbit. And he looked at it for a minute and he said, well, that's good, but what the heck is a hobbit? And that started he started creating this whole story about what are hobbits. And so he wrote the Hobbit, from that little moment of inspiration right there. And so he created it as a juvenile tale. Now, then we know, as we were discussing, that there was a big pause. He put out The Hobbit, and then there was World War II and the paper shortage. And not until 1949 did The Hobbit kind of get back out there again and build up momentum to the point that the publisher contacted Tolkien, and they said, Professor, if you could put out a sequel to The Hobbit or something about hobbits, we'd totally be up for that, because this book has done very, very well and people have really liked it. And Tolkien thought about that, and he says, he's like, okay. So then he put together a lot of the stuff that would nowadays be known as a Silmarillion, and presented it to them, and they were like, there's not any hobbits, and this is completely different. But if you look at the time period, that's like more than a 10, like this was like in the early 50s, like probably 1950, 51. It was probably 49 when they approached him about it. That's like that's like a 12-year gap. His kids had grown up. He was no longer, entertaining them, and, they were now young adults and out of the house for the most part. They were either at school or starting their own lives. And so he had been thinking about things. He's like, well, I'll do things in a different kind of way. And the Silmarillion is like a huge exploration of mythos and language and epic poetry and all this stuff. And, they said, well, there's not any hobbits in it. So they kind of brought it back, and the press was like, So then, for a couple, up until, 53, or so, he started working on the Lord of the Rings from there, and he got stuck on it, like we were talking about. Like, he didn't really know where to go with it for a long time until he started picking up his stride. And he did that by looking back at his established work in the Silmarillion and all that mythos. And he said, well, I don't want to just waste all this stuff. I've spent like 20 years thinking about it. And he picked up there, and so he created the Lord of the Rings, which he envisioned as a whole book. And and like, he was very practical. He says, like, hi, that you put all 3 books put together, and that is a huge hefty tome. And the publisher's like, Professor, we physically printing this, it's like bigger than an encyclopedia. How about we break it up into 3 different books? And that was also something, because they're like, well, and then people can pay for it 3 different times to get the whole story. But he kind of reluctantly said, well, okay, we can split it up. But he was a very different man, and he had different stories that he wanted to tell at that time. So that's and we don't necessarily see that from our perspective where we are in the present.
Yeah.
than he was in his driver's seat. So I think that it's all interrelated to that. And then he started working on the Silmarillion, again, he started working on it again after the Lord of the Rings was out, and he just kept tinkering with it, and he never was able to complete that. So that was
on Twitter today. There was a woman who did. She just posted something random. It was the most ridiculous tweet I've ever read in my entire life. She said she spent 7 hours working on 2 paragraphs, and I just laughed my ass off. Thought it was the most ridiculous thing anybody ever tweeted in my entire life. And now I'm looking at J.R.R Tolkien, and I'm thinking to myself, yep, this is a guy who would spend 7 hours working on 2 paragraphs.
I don't know if I've ever spent 7 hours on two paragraphs.
I've spent 7 hours on 2 paragraphs, but I would imagine this guy did.
but dang it, there have been times that it felt like I've been working for 7 hours on 2 paragraphs. But I'm not. I think I've told you before. I am not a swift writer at all. Like I wrote for probably 6 or 8 hours today, and I got 1,000 words in. That's hideously slow compared to a lot of people, but I do things differently, and I edit as I go, and I go back and reread, and for some time, and I can do more word count some days, depending upon if I'm doing research on the fly, but sometimes sometimes it's also a very difficult scene that I'm writing, and it can take me a long time. Like I can labor over just a few words, or the way that I've got the words here or there. But that's the way that I go. I like to envision myself being like Godzilla. I'm like slow, I'm prodding, but I'm relentless. I just kind of have to keep on going, and no matter what happens, I don't slow down. I'm
in rewrite mode right now on my thing. I'm like 40 pages in.
Yeah,
it's taking me forever. I'm like 200 words a day going, oh, that's nothing. But I'm like constantly deleting and reshaping. It's like, I hate this so much.
Yeah, when you're editing, the whole word count a day thing just completely collapses. It makes no, because like it might, wow, I wrote like 200 words today, but you really didn't. You deleted 1,400, 2,000 words, and then you rewrote it all over again. So you just have to be like, I've noticed that my experience with writing is like many authors dread the editing process because it takes forever, and like there's tears and blood and hissy fits and other things that go on when they're editing. For me, it's like, okay, I got feedback, and now I'm going to work on it a little bit. It just rolls off my back for the most part. Even if I have a lot of work to do, I don't find it frustrating. And I think that's because I do a lot of pre-edits before I even put it before anybody else. And that's just my style. And that probably wouldn't work out for a lot of people, or even most writers. But that's just the way that I do things, and I accept that.
I'm looking forward to some feedback. I've been with this thing for so long. I'm really looking forward to getting some beta readers on this thing. So anyway, are we happy with Tolkien for the time being?
Oh, I'm always happy with Tolkien. I think that we've gotten in a good we've in format this time, Brian. We didn't go over by a half an hour, so I think that we found a good place to stop on. I think we have a good timbre and
I think so too
of the conversation. This is very enjoyable to talk with you.
Yeah, I enjoyed this conversation as well, and thanks for hanging out with me for the last hour. I really appreciate it. We'll do this again with either Tolkien, if you think of anything else you want to discuss. I think we wrung him pretty dry. We could do the movies.
Why don't we talk about Lewis before? I know that you're a big fan of Lewis, and I'll let you kind of like.
Man, I read those books so much when I was a kid. I probably have read each one of them 17 times each. Horse and His Boy was like one of my favorites. I just read it so many times.
Yeah, I'll let you get on the driver's seat on that. I know I hope you don't feel like I kind of talk too much, but I love Tolkien and I know a lot. I just wanted to share what I've learned.
Yeah, man, I really appreciate it. Well,
but we'll do. How about we do Lewis? I'd love to talk some about Lewis.
Definitely, we'll do. I like letting you drive. I am the number one seat in this thing. But all right, Jason, thanks, man. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome, Brian. Always a pleasure to speak with you, and I'll talk to you next time.
All right, man. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.